August 1944. The war has turned against Japan. The docks of Yokosuka hum with tension and exhaustion. Sparks rain from the hull of a captured submarine. American, steel gray, and impossibly clean. A team of Japanese naval engineers stands around its open hatches. Their uniforms cling to their backs in the suffocating humidity. The air smells of rust, diesel, and the sour bite of salt carried in from Tokyo Bay. Inside, the air is still. One engineer wipes his brow, peers through the dim corridor, and freezes. A network of ducts, valves, and filters runs along the ceiling. A cooling system. He touches the vent, feels the faint residue of Freon oil, and stares in disbelief. Air conditioning. On a combat submarine, in a nation where crews sleep beside torpedoes drenched in sweat and mildew, this discovery feels otherworldly. The engineers exchange quiet, uneasy glances. How could an enemy be so indulgent, or so prepared, to bring comfort into the depths of war? Above them, the sound of cicadas swells. Beneath them, the ocean lies heavy and silent, holding a truth colder than steel. A truth about what this war was really built upon. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific Ocean was no longer Japan's dominion. The empire that had once swept across the east in a storm of ambition now found itself cornered, its fleets scattered, and its supply lines bleeding through the veins of the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once proud, fast, and feared, faced an enemy it could no longer match in scale or stamina. Across the horizon of that vast ocean, an invisible armada prowled beneath the waves. Silent hunters, born from American shipyards, forged from the rhythm of industry and electricity. The U.S. Navy's submarine fleet. Japan entered the war believing courage and devotion could overcome material limits. Its engineers, steeped in the traditions of discipline and scarcity, built machines for men they believed would endure anything. To them, endurance was not a burden. It was proof of spirit. Crews were expected to sweat, to suffocate, to sleep in corners beside live warheads. But across the Pacific, America fought a different war. Theirs was a war of systems, logistics, comfort, predictability. When an American sailor descended into the hull of a Gato-class submarine, he entered not just a vessel of war, but a carefully balanced ecosystem. Every gauge, every valve, every conduit was measured for function and for human endurance. It was a philosophy rooted in abundance, not wasteful, but pragmatic. The U.S. understood something Japan had not yet faced, that modern war was as much about sustaining the mind as it was about firing the weapon. By 1944, these two ideologies clashed beneath the ocean's skin. Japanese submarines, smaller, hotter, and poorly ventilated, carried crews who fought both the enemy and their own exhaustion. In contrast, American submariners patrolled for weeks in pressurized comfort, maintaining alertness, efficiency, and morale. From the outside, it seemed decadent. From within, it was survival by design. And so, when Japanese engineers later stood inside a captured U.S. submarine at Yokosuka, what they saw was not just a technological puzzle. It was a reflection of a civilization built on different foundations. Their tools were steel and discipline. America's were power and foresight. Both were forged in struggle. But one had learned to make endurance humane. The United States entered World War II with an engineering momentum no other nation could rival. From Detroit's automobile lines to the shipyards of Groton, Connecticut, industrial rhythm became military poetry. It was a war not merely fought, but manufactured. When the Navy commissioned its new fleet submarines in the early 1940s, the Gato class, followed by the Balao, they were designed as floating fortresses of endurance. These were not short-range scouts like Japan's I-boats. They were deep-sea predators meant to roam for months, silently stalking the arteries of Japan's commerce. The challenge lay in the Pacific itself, a brutal theater of heat, humidity, and corrosion. Deep beneath the tropical waters, air pressure and condensation could cripple delicate equipment. Moisture fogged optics, swelled electrical contacts, and caused torpedo guidance systems to fail. American engineers saw a pattern. Technology was only as reliable as the environment sustaining it. And so, a radical solution emerged: the installation of air conditioning units aboard every fleet submarine. At first, it sounded absurd, even to some within the Navy. Cooling systems were heavy, power-hungry, and maintenance-intensive. But the argument wasn't comfort, it was function. Electronic circuits, sonar panels, and gyroscopic fire control computers demanded stable air. Sweat and heat were as dangerous as enemy depth charges. Thus, the air conditioner became a silent weapon. It preserved not only the crew's focus, but also the mechanical precision of a vessel that could travel from Pearl Harbor to the South China Sea and back without surfacing. Meanwhile, Japan's industrial structure was already straining under the weight of blockade and scarcity. Copper, aluminum, and oil, the very veins of modern machinery, grew scarce. Air conditioning was unthinkable. Even proper ventilation was a luxury. Engineers prioritized propulsion and weaponry, not comfort. The expectation was that the human spirit would fill the gap. In a sense, it did. Japanese crews endured heat exceeding 45 degrees, 113 degrees, within their steel hulls, humidity nearing saturation, mold-coated instruments, condensation pooled beneath bunks, and electrical systems shorted under the constant damp. To breathe was to drink the air itself. For the Americans, every degree of coolness was a degree of clarity. For the Japanese, every drop of sweat was a badge of sacrifice. Both sides believed in victory, but one had mechanized endurance, while the other sanctified it. That divergence, invisible on the battlefield, shaped everything that followed. From how the crews fought, to how they thought, to how they survived, and eventually to how one side would learn from the other. Too late to change the war's tide. Inside a submarine, war becomes a matter of inches. The walls are close enough to feel your heartbeat against steel. The air tastes of oil, salt, and electricity. Days blur into endless watches, meals, and mechanical noise. It is here, beneath the surface, that the difference between endurance and exhaustion becomes the difference between life and death. For the American submariner, life aboard a fleet boat was harsh but measured. Air conditioning did not make the sea kind. It made it survivable. It drew sweat from skin, dried condensation from steel, and allowed 40 men to breathe without choking on their own breath. In that controlled climate, men could think clearly, aim precisely, sleep briefly but deeply. Their Japanese counterparts endured a world closer to imprisonment than combat. Inside the Imperial Navy's I-class submarines, temperatures often rose past 45 degrees Celsius. Ventilation fans whirred weakly, unable to cut the thick, wet air. Crews slept shirtless beside sweating torpedoes. The smell of diesel and unwashed men filled every cubic meter. Even eating became torment. Rice clumped from humidity, fish spoiled within days, and thirst was constant. When fatigue blurred the senses, mistakes followed. Small at first, a misread dial, a delayed response, an error in trim. In the silent world of submarines, a single mistake could mean discovery, and death by depth charge. The Americans could endure longer patrols, maintain stealth, and remain sharp. Comfort had become a strategic edge. The air conditioning system itself was an industrial symphony. Each Gato-class submarine carried dual Freon compressors, heat exchangers, and circulating fans integrated into the boat's electrical grid. It cooled the control room, electronics, and even the galley. It wasn't luxury. It was precision engineering serving endurance. The Japanese Navy, limited by resources, focused on propulsion and armament. They invested heavily in range, torpedo design, and speed, areas that symbolized offensive power. But in the enclosed labyrinth of submarine life, it wasn't the engine that determined survival, it was the environment around it. Electronics degraded faster in heat. Optical seals warped. Gun crews and sonar operators suffered heat stroke. Maintenance lagged behind exhaustion. The machinery was capable. The men were not. By 1943, the difference was measurable. U.S. submarines averaged 60 to 75 days per patrol. Japanese boats rarely exceeded 30. The endurance gap was not of spirit, but of system design. This was the silent revolution. Engineering empathy, the ability to anticipate human needs as a component of warfare. To the Japanese engineers standing in Yokosuka in 1944, that revelation came not as admiration, but as unease. What they saw inside that captured vessel was more than machinery. It was a philosophy in metal. Every submarine war diary tells a story of isolation, weeks of silence, months without sunlight, men reduced to routines. Eat, steer, repair, evade, attack, survive. In that silence, the smallest physical discomfort could grow into mental collapse. American command understood this early. Reports from pre-war exercises in the 1930s revealed how temperature and humidity directly affected reaction time, morale, and error rate. The Bureau of Ships concluded, "A cool sailor is an efficient sailor." This insight guided design priorities, transforming comfort into a measurable weapon. On U.S. submarines, the faint hum of the air conditioning was more than mechanical. It was psychological reassurance. It meant stability. It meant control. It became part of the rhythm of life. A soft, consistent sound beneath the symphony of valves and sonar pings. For the Japanese, there was no such sound. Only the thrum of heat, the whine of engines, and the pulse of sweat dripping from their own foreheads. In those conditions, irritation became anger. Anger became fatigue, and fatigue bred silence. Not the tactical silence of stealth, but the emotional silence of despair. When war forces men to live like ghosts, even the temperature of air becomes a measure of civilization. In Japanese naval doctrine, suffering was sanctified. It was proof of loyalty, the endurance of hardship as a moral victory. The Bushido Code, once suited for the sword, now lingered in the steel of submarines. Comfort was considered softness, and softness was weakness. This mindset shaped machines as much as it shaped men. Japanese submarines, while technically advanced, were built for warriors, not workers. The interior was functional but merciless. Living quarters were secondary to weapon storage. Space was measured not by comfort, but by sacrifice. The Americans designed differently. Their engineers saw no virtue in suffering. A sailor was not a monk. He was an operator. His focus was his weapon. His well-being was an asset. This philosophical divide, invisible in blueprints, was visible in every rivet, every pipe, every vent of an American submarine. To Japanese engineers in 1944, air conditioning was almost insulting, as if the enemy believed war could be made bearable. Yet, that was the quiet genius. America had learned to mechanize mercy. Strategy begins with logistics and ends with endurance. The U.S. submarine fleet, though smaller than Japan's at the start, would go on to strangle Japan's maritime lifelines. By 1945, American submarines had sunk over half of Japan's merchant fleet and a third of its navy. Each long patrol depended on systems that kept crews alert, healthy, and coordinated. Air conditioning preserved not just comfort, but efficiency. Electronics functioned longer, torpedoes performed better, and men stayed focused even after 70 days at sea. Japan's submarines, meanwhile, grew increasingly erratic. Heat and moisture damaged equipment. Communications failed. Food spoiled. Crews fell ill from exhaustion and infection. A weapon without endurance is not a weapon. It is a tomb. And so, in an irony written by history, Japan's faith in human endurance was defeated by America's faith in human limitation. Yokosuka Naval Yard. Autumn 1944. The tide of war had shifted. Japan's cities trembled beneath American bombers, and her fleets, once proud symbols of imperial reach, now hid within the archipelago's harbors. The submarine pens at Yokosuka echoed with silence. Then one morning, the silence broke, not with engines or shells, but with curiosity. Word spread through the yard. A captured American submarine had arrived. It was badly damaged, retrieved from shallow waters, yet intact enough to study. Engineers from the Kure and Yokosuka technical divisions were summoned. Among them were men who had built Japan's I-boats, proud, precise craftsmen of steel. They gathered like priests entering a rival temple. Inside, they found a world alien in purpose. The corridors were wide by submarine standards. Electrical conduits were neatly lined and color-coded. The control room felt organized, not cluttered with improvisations and emergency fixes. Every dial was labeled in clear, concise English, every mechanism reachable without contortion. But it was the atmosphere that struck them first. Cool, dry, clean. They located the machinery responsible. 2 compressors, pipes branching into ducts, valves labeled cooling system, compressor unit. One engineer, Lieutenant Commander Tokunaga, scribbled a note into his pad. American submarine equipped with air conditioning, designed for continuous crew comfort. Unbelievable. The disbelief wasn't arrogance, it was awe. Japan's industrial culture had mastered precision in metallurgy, optics, and weaponry. But this was comfort turned into strategy. Air conditioning on a submarine wasn't indulgence. It was forethought in its purest form. They traced the pipes into the living quarters. Even here, there were small grills positioned above bunks, feeding cool air across sleeping sailors. A coffee percolator sat beside a radio receiver. In the galley, canned fruit and preserved butter, impossible luxuries for any Japanese crew, rested in neat racks. The engineers stood in silence. For a moment, none took notes. They simply looked. The air felt different, not just in temperature, but in meaning. Here was a machine built not merely to destroy, but to sustain. Every switch and circuit whispered of confidence. The kind that came from endless resources, coordinated labor, and an understanding of the human as part of the mechanism, not separate from it. Back outside, the Japanese officers debated. Some called it wasteful, others ingenious, but all agreed. This was not the same kind of war they had prepared for. This was industrial war, mechanical civilization waging battle through systems, not spirit. The Americans had engineered not just machines of war, but conditions for war, environments where fatigue, heat, and despair were calculated, neutralized, erased. It was the first time many of these men realized that America's strength was not only in numbers, but in design empathy. What they saw chilled them more than the air itself. As the inspection continued, the engineers documented everything with clinical precision: temperature controls, duct routing, compressor weights, and pressure differentials. The report's tone was mechanical, but between the lines, an unease rippled through the words. They had entered a foreign logic. In the Japanese approach to warfare, discomfort was natural, even moral. Men were expected to bear it, to transcend it. Yet here stood a war machine where human fragility had been accounted for, compensated by design, not courage. To the American mind, this was not softness. It was efficiency through empathy. Lieutenant Commander Tokunaga later wrote, in a captured technical note found after the war. The American sailor fights in an environment that preserves his body and his spirit. His machinery is tended with the same care as his comfort. This is a different understanding of war. It was a revelation that reached far beyond mechanics. The air conditioning unit symbolized something profound, a belief that war could be made rational, predictable, even humane. That victory depended not on the suppression of human weakness, but on its management. That quiet hum became a sound they could not unhear. It haunted them as they returned to their own submarines, where crews still lived amid suffocating heat and the stink of oil, where navigation instruments fogged with moisture, where every mission was a trial of endurance. The contrast was no longer theoretical. American submarines could patrol for twice as long, their electronics stable, their crews alert, their morale intact. Japanese vessels, pushed to exhaustion, returned home weary, their systems corroded, and their men drained. The captured reports were filed, studied, and discussed among Japan's naval technologists. Some proposed adapting similar systems, but by 1944, it was too late. The Empire's factories lay shattered under air raids. Aluminum and copper were rationed by the ounce. Even the most visionary designs could not escape material starvation. In a single inspection, the engineers had glimpsed not just superior machinery, they had seen the architecture of a different future. The air conditioning system, humming gently inside an American submarine, had revealed the heartbeat of democracy itself. The belief that individual well-being was worth engineering for. It was the sound of a society that built from the inside out, protecting its people first, then its purpose. That discovery, recorded in ink and disbelief, marked a turning point in how Japan's post-war engineers would think. Comfort, once dismissed as weakness, would become a new form of strength. But in that moment, in 1944, standing on the steel floor of a captured submarine, it was a sound of quiet defeat. A whisper of cool air that carried the truth of industrial civilization. By late 1944, Japan's undersea fleet was collapsing. The Imperial Navy had once boasted more than 100 submarines. Long-range, powerful vessels capable of reaching the Indian Ocean and beyond. But their missions had changed. The Empire was shrinking, its supply routes bleeding dry. Submarines, once hunters, became lifelines, ferrying fuel, food, and medicine to isolated garrisons across the Pacific. Inside these vessels, life descended into misery. Without air conditioning or proper ventilation, the heat became an enemy of its own. Diesel fumes and sweat mingled into a choking haze. Mold crept across the walls. Condensation dripped from the ceilings. Men stripped to their underclothes, their skin raw with rashes. Instruments corroded faster than they could be cleaned. Reports from the I-176 and I-41 documented conditions so dire that officers had to rotate crewmen from the engine rooms every 15 minutes to prevent collapse. One log entry, retrieved after the war, reads, "Temperature exceeds 47 degrees. No air to breathe. The crew vomits and grows dizzy. We pray for surfacing, but surfacing meant risk. American aircraft ruled the sky. The very act of seeking air invited destruction." The same ocean, just hundreds of miles away, told a different story. American submariners aboard Balao-class boats cruised the same waters, not in comfort, but in stability. The air conditioning kept electronics dry, torpedoes reliable, and men alert. They ate canned fruit, rehydrated meat, and even baked bread in cooled galleys. When they dove for long hours under enemy pursuit, the air inside remained breathable and dry. This difference, invisible on paper, decided countless encounters. An American submarine could wait, motionless, in ambush for 48 hours without losing concentration. A Japanese boat, drenched in heat, would be forced to surface within 12. The outcome was mathematical. By the end of 1944, U.S. submarines had destroyed nearly 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. over 4.8 million tons of shipping. The Empire's economy suffocated as surely as its sailors. Each torpedo fired by the U.S. Navy was not only a weapon of steel, but of environment, fired by a mind still sharp, a hand still steady, a body still cooled by design. The American submarine campaign was ruthless, but it was also clinical. Every successful patrol was proof that warfare could be mechanized with almost surgical detachment. In contrast, Japanese submarine crews continued to die not only from enemy depth charges, but from exhaustion, suffocation, and disease. Their courage remained unbroken, but courage could not outlast physics. By 1945, less than one-fifth of Japan's pre-war submarine fleet remained operational. Of the thousands of men who served below, most never saw land again. Their final hours were spent in darkness and heat, in the womb of a dying empire. The war ended not with glory, but with silence. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Emperor's voice, the unthinkable surrender, reshaped Japan's soul overnight. The empire that had built weapons for warriors now faced the ashes of its own ambition. And in that aftermath, amid ruins of shipyards and universities, a strange rebirth began. Under Allied occupation, American officers toured Japanese industrial sites, not as conquerors, but as tutors. Among them were naval engineers and scientists who had designed the very submarines Japan had once examined in awe. They came not to boast, but to rebuild. And among their students were some of the same men who had once inspected the captured American boat at Yokosuka. In technical exchanges arranged by the U.S. Navy and the Civil Communications Section, Japanese engineers studied refrigeration, electrical systems, and environmental control. Air conditioning, once dismissed as decadence, became a field of fascination. Manuals, schematics, and compressor blueprints circulated through classrooms in Tokyo and Osaka. The lessons went deeper than machinery. They were philosophical. For the first time, Japanese engineers were encouraged to design for the human. Factories rebuilt under occupation adopted worker-focused layouts. Ships were redesigned with ventilated quarters. Civil buildings integrated cooling systems. The industrial spirit that had once fueled militarism now turned toward comfort, efficiency, and peace. The irony was profound. The same principle that had humbled Japan's engineers in 1944, comfort as strength, now became a foundation of their post-war miracle. By the 1950s, companies like Mitsubishi Electric, Hitachi, and Daikin began mass-producing air conditioning units, exporting them across Asia. The very technology once seen as an emblem of American indulgence became a symbol of Japan's rebirth through discipline and innovation. Those who remembered the war never forgot the first time they felt cooled air inside a captured submarine. They had touched the future then, a future they would later build themselves. For the Americans, that hum of cool air had been a whisper of democracy. For post-war Japan, it became a promise that true strength lies not in enduring suffering, but in mastering it. Decades later, Japanese engineers would design some of the world's most advanced submarines, the Soryu class and Taige class, equipped with sophisticated environmental systems and quiet propulsion, the legacy of lessons learned in defeat. In every valve and duct, there lingers the memory of that moment in 1944 when heat and ideology collided and a simple hum of machinery became the sound of transformation. In the end, the war left behind not just ruins, but echoes, sounds that still hum in memory. For Japan, one of those sounds was the steady rhythm of a compressor deep within the hull of a captured enemy submarine. It was not the roar of battle, nor the scream of engines. It was calm, controlled, a man-made breeze against a world consumed by fire. That air conditioning unit, humming in the depths of the Pacific War, carried more than cold air. It carried an idea that freedom, at its core, was not chaos or indulgence, but the deliberate protection of human dignity. The American engineers who built it did not design comfort as luxury. They designed it as strategy. The belief that a mind kept clear and a body kept whole could fight longer, think sharper, and endure more than any code of sacrifice ever could. To the Japanese engineers who once stared at those vents in disbelief, the realization came slowly, painfully, that compassion itself could be industrialized, that a nation's true strength is measured not by how much suffering it can endure, but by how much of it it can prevent. The hum of that cooling system became, in time, the hum of new cities rising from ruin. Tokyo's neon nights, Osaka's factories, the quiet comfort of homes once built for survival, now built for life. And perhaps that is the final irony of war, that out of its furnace came a lesson in balance. Power need not be cruel. Efficiency need not be cold. The same current that once cooled a submarine in 1944 would, decades later, cool the rooms of a peaceful world. The sound of air moving through steel, once a whisper of American abundance, became a universal symbol of progress, a reminder that even in the darkest depths, humanity endures best when it refuses to suffocate itself in the name of glory. Beneath the waves, the hum continues, soft, eternal, and unmistakably human.